Hey everybody, Dr. Johnson here, and we are entering into our learning and development module here. So we are going to go through a few of the concepts from your reading, and I'll emphasize some materials that will be important as we get into talking about case study part 3. So when we're talking about learning and development, we're talking about several different concepts, and these terms will come up in our discussion over the next several class sessions. Learning, what we're talking about here, is really this acquisition of competencies that enhance employee performance and build career potential. So it's an overarching term that we'll be using. Development and training are two different efforts that the organization embarks upon to promote learning. When we're talking about development, we're talking about this joint effort by the organization and employees to build employee competencies for mutual long-term benefit. So this is a long-term effort by the organization and the employees. It's typically collaborative. When we're talking about training, really what we're talking about is stuff related to specific competencies that are important for the job the person is in today. So it's usually job-related competencies. Development may not be specifically job-related for today. It may be about tomorrow's job. So development is more long-term. Training is typically more immediate, focused on today's job. So with those terms and those definitions under our belts, let's move into a couple of the different models that we were talking about in your reading for today. One is this idea of strategy-driven development, and this fits right into the case study that you've been working on throughout the semester, where we are trying to get our HR management strategies and practices, have those flow from our business strategy. And so we've looked at this slide before, but now we've added in here recruiting and selection and development. And a couple of you in your posts for today, your online posts, recognize that recruiting came from that people were selected from candidate pools based on the competencies that the organization had identified. And then in your training, you were looking to develop specific or further develop specific competencies as well. So you made some connections between the strategy-driven development and your personal experience. As we talk about developing competencies, one way to think about that is this model called the learning and development ecosystem. And this comes from our reading in Meister and Willyerd. This learning and development ecosystem is based on two different tensions or two different axes here. One concept that we're thinking about is what is created and guided by the organization versus what is created and guided by employees. So to what extent is the training or the development activities going to be created by the organization and delivered to the organization in a formal way? The alternative is what's going to be created and guided by employees based on their perceived understanding and needs. So that's one way we can look at training and development. Another is this idea of competency-based learning versus context-based learning. So if we're talking about competency-based learning, we're talking about training to specific competencies, knowledge, skills, abilities, other attributes, etc., that are important to the organization and to employees. The other focus of our development activity, could be in context-based learning. So to what extent is this training taking place experientially on the job, in the context where the skills, knowledge, and abilities will need to be exhibited? So we've got these two axes, then these two considerations as we put together a learning and development program or a training program will give us 4 different quadrants or specific methodologies that we can use for developing and training our workforce. The first quadrant is formal learning, or what the model calls guided competency development. And you can see this is in two places. It takes into account are created and guided by the organization. So formal learning, guided competency development is created and guided by the organization, and it focuses on specific competencies. So when we're thinking about guided competency development or formal learning, we can think about formal classroom training, formal online courses, and of course we're all familiar with those kinds of activities. And these can be particularly important when we're looking at specific skills or specific competencies that our workforce needs, that where there's little room for on-the-job trial and error. So when we're talking about laws or maybe things that need to be taught in regards to a production line, particularly if we're looking at a regulated industry like pharmaceuticals or defense or something where an error in production can result in somebody being harmed or injured or even killed. Those kinds of things will require formal development and formal training. So we've got quadrant 1 as formal learning. Quadrant 2, now we are still working with programs that are created and guided by the organization, but now rather than in the formal classroom, these are in context and on the job. So we'll call this quadrant experiential learning, and these are some examples of experiential learning. So structured on-the-job training with formal or assessed learning outcomes. So we've got this combination that it is on the job, right, context-based, but it's still created and guided by the organization. We're trying to still get specific things accomplished here based on what the organization identifies as being important. So structured on the job training, online simulations, rotational assignments would also fall into this category. And the rotational assignments specifically would be more development oriented than training oriented. So when we're talking about rotational assignments, we're talking about a temporary assignment in a new position where people are learning new skills and they have to exercise new skills, etc. And those are often folks are often placed in those assignments or given the opportunity for those assignments based on their career aspirations and where the organization thinks they can go from a succession planning perspective. So our next quadrant is quadrant 3, and here we are back over on competency-based learning, but now we're looking at programs that are created and guided by employees. And mentoring falls into this category. So we can talk about career mentoring, we can talk about position-specific mentoring. All of these different types of mentoring are useful, and again, in the best programs are really created and guided by employees. You will see, and I have seen, mentoring programs that are created by the organization, but most of the research demonstrates that the bulk of successful mentoring programs inside the organizations are created and guided by employees. They can certainly be promoted by the organization and facilitated, but the content of the experience is best done when it's created and guided by employees. And then in our final quadrant, we have peer-to-peer learning. So this is what Meister and Willyerd call social contextual learning. And when we're talking about social contextual learning here, we're talking about people and employees. Again, this is created and guided by employees, about employees sharing the effort. And this takes place, again, on the job or in the context. In the context of on-the-job training. So we can see here we've got employee-guided on-the-job training. We might even have something like employee-developed video libraries. Some organizations have set up inside, on their side of the firewall, things that are similar, or applications that are similar to YouTube, where employees can create videos, develop them, post them for other employees, Cheesecake Factory had done this a few years ago, and I believe they're still using that tool inside, where learners can post videos based on new techniques they've learned for assembling meals in the kitchen, maybe some cooking techniques, other things, even customer service techniques that have been successful. And employees can access all those videos to develop their skills. And this, of course, is an example of learner-developed content. So that is our learning and development ecosystem, and we'll be using that as we move into case study part 3. So now's not too early to be thinking about case study part 3, and in the learning and development section for part 3, this is the core issue that you'll be dealing with, considering which quadrants of the learning and development ecosystem are utilized at your case study company. And then not only identifying which quadrants are used for different training, and this would be particularly in regard to your core position that you're focusing on, but then the appropriateness of the use of that quadrant, given your company's strategy and sources of competitive advantage. So we're still talking about strategic development here, and this will help you to focus on and use these tools in regards to case study part 3. So we will continue to talk about this in class and online, and certainly refer back to this video as is needed, and contact me with any questions.